The November wind cut sharp across the open fields of the American Midwest as a long train squealed to a stop. Its steel wheels groaned against the rails, sending up sparks and a deep, hollow screech that echoed across flat farmland. On board, behind barred windows, and under the wary eyes of U.S. military police, hundreds of German soldiers shifted and craned for a glimpse outside. They had been pulled from the shattered remnants of Rommel's once feared Afrika Korps, captured among the burning hulks of tanks and trucks in Tunisia, bundled onto Liberty ships, and ferried across an ocean they'd once been told was theirs to command. They had imagined this. Arrival for weeks, cruel guards, starvation, rations, hatred in the eyes of farmers whose sons were off fighting in Europe. Nazi propaganda had painted America as a land of chaos and brutality. The men whispered their fears in the rattling dark of the railcar. What will they do to us? Will they beat us? Starve us? The train hissed to a stop at a tiny station. Outside, instead of angry mobs or snarling dogs, stood a neat row of American guards in long coats, rifles slung but not pointed. A few locals had gathered, men in work clothes, women in heavy coats, children peering wide-eyed from behind their parents. Doors clanged open, roused down, slowly. A guard called, but the tone wasn't vicious, just firm. One by one, the Germans stepped down into a world they'd been taught to hate and now could barely recognize. A few paces away, beyond a low barbed wire fence hastily strung across prairie grass, sat rows of unfinished wooden barracks. Smoke curled from a field kitchen, and the smell astonishing after shipboard. Rations of fresh bread and coffee drifted across the wind. It was Thanksgiving week, 1943. The POS didn't know that yet. They only knew they were alive, far from bombs and deserts, standing in a country whose soldiers had beaten them but not broken them. Some clutched their coats tighter. Others dared to look up and meet the Americans' eyes. The guards watched warily, but there was no cruelty in their faces. Then something deeply unexpected happened. A U.S. sergeant, face ruddy from the cold, barked an order. Trucks pulled forward, carrying lumber, tools, nails. An interpreter explained. The camp was too small for this many men. They'd be building their own quarters. You'll work under guard, but you'll have shelter, better than these tents. A ripple of confusion passed through the prisoners. Build our own houses. In Germany, captives were slaves. Here, the captives were pragmatic, even respectful. One Afrika Korps corporal later wrote home, "They handed us saws and hammers, two enemies." I felt dizzy with relief and shame all at once. For men who expected cages and cruelty, this first day was already rewriting assumptions. By 1943, the United States faced a staggering logistical problem. Its armies were winning, but victory meant prisoners, and lots of them. Operation Torch in North Africa had captured entire German regiments. The Afrika Korps surrender alone produced more than 150,000 Axis people. Britain, straining to feed itself, couldn't keep them all. So ships full of defeated Germans crossed the Atlantic, guarded but unharmed, heading for a country with space, food, and rails that stretched forever. The War Department built an entire invisible empire by war's end. Over 500 main POW camps and 500 branch sites dotted the U.S., from Maine pine forests to Texas cotton fields. Each was ringed by barbed wire and guard towers, but designed with an eye toward the 1929 Geneva Convention. The U.S. wanted to show it honored international law and hoped decent treatment would encourage surrender and protect American POS in Europe. But beyond legal duty, there was raw pragmatism. The war had sucked millions of young Americans overseas. Farms and factories were desperate for hands. Why not let healthy prisoners work safely and fairly to fill the gap? At the new camp in rural Kansas, that first Thanksgiving week, the routine began immediately. Roll call, medical checks, distribution of blankets. The men expected thin soup and cruelty. Instead, breakfast came. Eggs, coffee, white bread with jam. A murmur of astonishment ran down the line. "This is for prisoners," one asked aloud. A German NCO tried to maintain soldierly distance, but his hunger betrayed him. The Americans noticed. Feed a man, calm him. That was the quiet calculation. Housing was basic but solid. Long wooden barracks with pot-belly stoves, cots lined in rows, windows shuttered against the wind, showers, real plumbing. In Africa, they'd lived on sand and flies. Here was warmth, the shock wind deeper. Guards weren't monsters. They were young, many only a few years older than the prisoners themselves. Farm boys from Nebraska, mechanics from Ohio, teachers from Iowa, men who'd been drafted and trained, but not hardened, into cruelty. They kept rifles handy, but also traded cigarettes, nodded at good work, even cracked jokes. Some prisoners later said the first psychological crack came not from freedom, but from fairness. I had believed America was decadent and cruel. One wrote after the war, but they fed us, paid us, trusted us with saws. It was like waking from a bad dream. Once barracks rose and fences were secure, the War Department faced another reality. What to do with thousands of bored soldiers behind wire? Idleness was dangerous. Work kept men sane. And outside the fence, America desperately needed labor. The Geneva Convention allowed nanofizers to work for fare, pay credited as scrip to buy small comforts. So began one of the largest labor mobilizations of the war. German POW work detachments. Farmers soon saw trucks of German prisoners arrive each morning, guarded but smiling, ready to pick cotton, harvest wheat, chop timber, repair fences. The vast distances and unfamiliar language made escape impractical. Only a handful ever tried. For the prisoners, work was relief. Days passed faster when you had a task. Many were farm boys themselves, quick with tools and livestock. They took pride in proving their skill and in earning a few cents for extra soap or a harmonica. One Kansas farmer later recalled, they worked like demons. Quiet at first, then they'd hum songs. We couldn't talk much, but a smile's a smile. By late November, harvest was done. Cold wind swept empty fields. Inside the camp, German POWs prepared for winter, patching roofs, stacking firewood. Outside, families planned Thanksgiving, a feast older than the Republic itself. It was then that something quietly radical happened. Some farmers, grateful for help, looked at the guarded young men who'd cut their wheat or fixed their fences and felt curiosity, pity, even. These weren't abstract Nazis. They were kids far from home. A Nebraska family, the Johnsons, according to local oral history, asked the camp sergeant, could they thank the work crew with a meal? The sergeant hesitated, but regulations allowed supervised social contact if security held, so he said yes. On Thanksgiving Day, a guarded truck rumbled up the Johnson farm road. 6 Germans climbed down, uncertain. Inside the warm farmhouse, a long table groaned under turkey, potatoes, pies. The smell alone was disarming. Americans motioned them in. Hats came off. Someone said grace. The prisoners bowed awkwardly. Plates filled. Forks clinked. At first, silence ruled, but then laughter, broken English. Halting German. One POW later wrote, it was the first time since capture we felt like men, not animals. They looked us in the eye and fed us. Word spread back at camp that night like wildfire. Some couldn't believe it. Others envied those lucky few. But the idea took root. The enemy could also be human. Through the long winter of 1943, rumors of the Thanksgiving dinner traveled from barracks to barracks. Some men dismissed it as fantasy. Others swore they had spoken to the lucky prisoners who ate at an American table. When work crews rolled out the next morning, guards noticed new curiosity. German voices asked shy questions in halting English. Thanksgiving. Good food? The Johnson family's gesture was not isolated. Similar scenes began appearing across the rural Midwest and South. Farmers whose fields had been saved by POW labor quietly asked their local camp liaison if they could feed their boys. Sometimes it was pie and coffee in the barn after long days of corn harvest. Other times it was full Sunday dinners with watchful MPs nearby, but easy enough that laughter broke the language barrier. At first, the War Department hesitated. These were still enemy soldiers. But commanders also saw a change. Where hostility and tension might have brewed, small kindnesses built order. Camp reports began noting improved morale, reduced escape attempts, and better discipline. Guards realized the simple truth. A man who has been treated decently is less likely to risk his life fleeing into a foreign land. For the prisoners, the effect was profound. Nazi indoctrination had painted Americans as mongrel savages, decadent, weak. Yet here were farm wives handing them coffee, children staring wide-eyed, but without hate. It shook something deep. I began to think. One later wrote, maybe what we were told was all lies. Even small gestures carried power. A Kansas woman wrapped homemade bread for the German workers to take back to camp. In Texas, a farmer's son traded a pocket knife for a carved wooden toy the POWs had whittled. A young Nebraska girl taught a group to say thank you in English. These were quiet, unreported encounters, but thousands happened. Inside the wire, camp life responded to this new atmosphere. Prisoners built their own decorations for Advent, carved nativity scenes, and rehearsed Christmas music. Guards, aware of homesickness, sometimes let them send extra cards or share food gifts. Some camps even organized Christmas plays that local Americans came to watch under supervision. The enemy was still behind barbed wire, but slowly the wire stopped feeling like a moral divide. Work continued to be the bridge. The U.S. desperately needed labor, especially as 1944 opened with more and more American men overseas. Posts cleared forests, cut pulpwood for paper and ammunition packaging, repaired railroads, and worked canneries. Farmers wrote to the War Department asking for their crews back next season. The system became so organized that some camps kept waiting lists of farmers eager for POW help. It wasn't all gentle. Security remained. Guards kept rifles close. Rules punished Nazi intimidation of fellow prisoners, which still flared at times. Die-hard party loyalists tried to shame or even attack men seen as friendly to Americans. But even this began to weaken. The daily evidence of fair treatment eroded ideological control. Younger soldiers, especially teenagers drafted in 1943, grew curious rather than hostile. Letters home carried coded astonishment. Censors cut anything revealing military details. But notes slipped through. Food good. Work okay. Americans. Decent. These fragments reached Germany, softening the hard edge of fear. Some historians believe they contributed to higher surrender rates later. Soldiers who heard captivity might be survivable were less likely to die fighting hopeless battles. The meals themselves became almost symbolic. One former prisoner remembered sitting in a warm kitchen while a farmer carved turkey. I felt shame and relief together. Shame for what our country had done. Relief that here I was, treated like a man. Another described a Thanksgiving prayer he barely understood but felt in his bones. They prayed for peace, for sons on both sides. We bowed our heads, and for a moment war stopped. Such moments rippled beyond the fences. American children learned their enemy, could smile and sing. Wives discovered these young Germans were much like the husbands and brothers they'd sent to war. Farmers, who once swore hatred, later wrote letters to former captives after the war. Some invited them back as guests decades later. Meanwhile, inside the U.S. command, quiet re-education programs expanded. Not formal brainwashing, but access to newspapers free of Nazi propaganda. Lectures about democracy, even screenings of films about post-war rebuilding. Combined with real-life decency outside the wire, these efforts planted seeds. POWs left camps with new eyes. Many would become part of democratic West Germany's backbone. By late 1944, the war's end loomed. Dinners with enemy workers were no longer rare novelties, but quietly known across small towns. Families who had hosted crews sometimes asked after them by name. In Alabama and Mississippi, locals brought pies to camp gates. In Iowa and Nebraska, farmers sent small gifts back when men rotated out. When Germany finally collapsed in spring, 1945, the news arrived in these camps like a slow wave. Some cheered, more simply sat, stunned. They had come here full of certainty about Hitler's promises and left facing a ruined homeland. Yet one thing they knew, Americans had shown a face very different from the caricature. Repatriation began. Slow and complex. Men boarded trucks and trains again, but this time with less fear. Some were almost reluctant to go, worried about starvation and chaos waiting back home. Farewells were often quiet but emotional. Farmers waved from porches. Children ran alongside convoys, calling out names they had learned. Guards shook hands or saluted discreetly. Many prisoners carried mementos, a photograph, a carved toy, a small Bible gifted by a host family. Some promised to write. Remarkably, many did. In the years after the war, letters crossed the Atlantic, halting English, careful German, expressing thanks, sharing news of rebuilding, asking about the families that once fed them. Decades later, survivors would still tell the Thanksgiving story. For some, it was the first time they questioned the Nazi vision of enemies as monsters. For others, it became the seed of lifelong affection for America. Historians tracing post-war reconciliation often find these humble farm tables as quiet turning points. And to Americans, those gestures seemed small at the time. Just a meal for the men who helped save a harvest, a bit of kindness in hard years. Yet together they built bridges as real as any diplomatic mission. The war was far from gentle, but in these unlikely corners of the Midwest and South, Thanksgiving lived up to its name. Gratitude given not just for harvests, but for survival, and for the possibility of peace even between enemies. When the guns finally fell silent in Europe, the mood inside the American camps shifted overnight. Guards who had once watched carefully for escape attempts now saw only exhausted men waiting for word from home. Victory banners hung in nearby towns. Church bells rang. Yet inside the wire, the sound was strangely muted. The prisoners were alive, but their country was rubble. News arrived in fragments. Letters delayed for months. Scraps of newspapers. Berlin had fallen. Hitler was dead. Families scattered or homeless. Some men sat on their bunks for hours, staring at the floor. Others wrote furiously, desperate for any connection. Even the most hardened party men had little to say. Ideology was no match for defeat. For the Americans, the end of the war meant a logistical marathon. Nearly 400,000 German POWs had to be sent home, but Europe's transport network lay in ruins. Many were first shipped to Britain or France to aid in clearing debris and rebuilding. Others would not reach Germany until 1946 or even 1947, but the U.S. wanted to send them back with some order and a sense of closure. In the meantime, camp life softened. The fences still stood, but patrols grew looser. Guards swapped stories, asked for German words, shared cigarettes more openly. Some officers allowed informal soccer matches with American soldiers. Men who had been enemies in North Africa now kicked a ball across Kansas dirt. Farmers begged the War Department to let their crews finish harvests. A few wrote letters of recommendation for particular POWs, hoping they'd have an easier time at home. Others quietly slipped farewell gifts, pocket knives, warm gloves, photographs of the farm. These gestures, small and human, left deep marks. The departure itself was emotional. Prisoners lined up with duffels of belongings, carvings, books, letters. Guards checked lists, shook hands. In some towns, families came to wave goodbye. A farmer's wife, who had once fed her POW crew, baked a final batch of bread and pressed it into their hands as trucks rumbled off. Children ran after the convoy, calling names they had learned. Hans, Karl. A few of the men wept silently. The ocean crossing back was nothing like the first. On the way to America, fear and propaganda had filled the holds. On the way back, there was quiet thought. Many of these young men had spent 2 or 3 years far from the front, fed and safe, exposed to a culture that worked without terror. They were returning to a shattered homeland with new eyes. Some were terrified, not of punishment, but of hunger and chaos. But many felt a flicker of hope. If an enemy could treat them fairly, perhaps the future need not be endless war. Historians have traced the subtle effect of these years. When West Germany began to rebuild, countless small-town mayors, teachers, and tradesmen were former people. They had learned basic English, new farming techniques, carpentry, even democratic habits. They had seen American abundance and fairness firsthand. That didn't erase the war, but it planted seeds. Decades later, those seeds blossomed in surprising ways. Former prisoners wrote letters back to the farms and towns where they had worked. Some returned to visit, bringing children and grandchildren to show where life changed for them. The Camp Algona Nativity, built from scraps in 1943, still draws visitors each Christmas. German families have donated to preserve it, sending notes. "Thank you for kindness to my father." In Texas, a group of ex-POWs built a memorial stone thanking the local community for humane treatment. One man returned in the 1980s and found the descendants of the farmer who had shared Thanksgiving dinner with him. Together, they stood in the same kitchen, now bright with modern light, and remembered that strange first feast. The memory of that meal, turkey and pie offered to enemies, took on symbolic weight. For the prisoners, it was the moment the war's hatred cracked. For Americans, it was proof that decency could coexist with strength. Even amid global conflict, a single act of hospitality had ripples neither side could imagine. Of course, the system wasn't perfect. There were incidents of abuse, escape, ideological violence inside some camps. War remained war, but compared to the brutality elsewhere, the American approach stood apart. It combined hard security with unexpected humanity, and it worked. Strategically, it encouraged surrender. Word filtered through German ranks. Captivity in America meant life, not death. Practically, it saved American farms and industry during labor shortages. Morally, it gave thousands of young men their first real contact with democratic fairness. That's why so many memoirs written decades later returned, not to the battles, but to a quiet meal on a farm, to the shock of being treated as human. Former prisoner Helmut Korgemeyer wrote, "Thanksgiving was the first day I felt free, though I was still a prisoner." Another remembered simply, "They killed our hatred with kindness." For the United States, the story still matters. It shows how a victorious nation can wield power, not just through weapons, but through example. It reminds us that even in total war, small mercies can shape history. The farmhouse table becomes a symbol, turkey carved under a roof built by enemy hands. Laughter halting but real. Guards standing watch but smiling. Real. Guards standing watch but smiling. No treaty was signed there, but peace began in miniature. Today, as visitors walk through former campsites, weathered barracks, preserved artifacts, photos of smiling work crews, the lesson feels immediate. Strength need not crush dignity. Even enemies can share bread and walk away changed. And for the storyteller, it's the perfect ending. Those first prisoners stepping off the train in terror, then weeks later, sitting at a Thanksgiving table, tasting unfamiliar kindness. The war didn't end there, but hatred started to.